to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us for an interview today with Pragma. Lovely to have you. I have a lot of questions. I want to start with COP because obviously it's just finished for this year. Why is it so important, do you think, for the oil and gas sector to be included in conversations and meetings like COP? There's been a lot of kind of back and forth about whether it's a good idea and where COP should be held. But from your perspective, why is it so important that the industry is involved in the conversation?
I think it's most important for the COP process itself. If we look back 3 years to Glasgow, we had, unfortunately and strangely, the industries that were responsible for 90% of global energy, not just oil and gas, but also coal and even nuclear, deplatformed, not even invited to the discussion. How can you have a conversation about climate without them present? I mean, ultimately, energy and climate are two sides of the same coin. If you try and address climate and ignore the world's energy, current consumption and future needs, you will fail. At the same time, if you try and just focus on energy and ignore the climate challenge, you'll fail. It's a shame that it's become a politicized wedge issue between parties left and right in different countries. Whenever I participate in private sector discussions with colleagues who are on the renewable side, we all see ourselves as trying to tackle both challenges together, providing maximum energy while reducing emissions. So I think what happened last year at COP28 in the UAE, where the energy companies were invited to the table, part of the conversation, we launched the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter. We're, as Crescent Petroleum, a proud signatory from among the first 55 companies to sign up, and that's grown since then, focusing on reducing methane emissions. I think it was very positive and was largely seen as positive. Now, there are some who are sort of ideologically against this or that form of energy. And of course, it's changed. Interestingly, if you look at a lot of the environmental groups that started in the 60s as anti-nuclear organizations, nuclear bombs and nuclear energy. Post-Cold War, that changed and they became more focused on climate. But they were still anti-nuclear. And they were pro-gas because they saw it rightly as the quickest way to replace coal, which is what the UK has done and the US has done. But more recently, I think after the shale gas revolution in the US showed that potentially there's a lot more gas there, they changed and tried to group gas with all the fossil fuels, even though oil is for transportation fuel and gas is for power and quite different, and tried to vilify all of them and the industry that produces them, which I always think is wrong. I always say it's like trying to blame farmers for obesity. It's societal consumption of energy. Not the industry that produces it. And only at COP28, nuclear became embraced again. Not by all. There are still some who are anti-nuclear. There's who are also anti-hydro. So they seem to be against most forms of energy, except for intermittent solar and wind, without a clear answer for what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. So my concern is, if you look at the world today, because of this ideological bent, we're seeing instead of gas plus renewables or nuclear plus renewables, which is the cleaner form of firm power, the only clean form, totally clean, is not using any, of course, but that's not an option, or using less at least, which is efficiency, which is useful. What we're seeing worldwide is coal plus renewables. So we're seeing emissions rising, cost rising, risks of blackouts, and increasing energy poverty, particularly among the 7 billion people in the developing world. So we're failing on all three of the legs of the stool of the so-called energy trilemma, which is affordability, availability, and sustainability.
Yeah. You've touched on it in terms of kind of some of the perceptions that perhaps people have who are not in the energy industry. But what do you think is the most dangerous misconception that exists today around climate change, around the energy industry, by the general public and or by policymakers?
So first of all, there's misinformation about the extent to which renewables energy are meeting total energy needs. The rise in renewables on the electricity side has been rapid and impressive, particularly solar, I would say, in my part of the world and other parts of the world where it makes sense. But two things. First of all, you can't store it really at scale and in a way that makes sense. The energy of a barrel of oil, which is $70 a barrel or thereabouts today, in batteries, you would need several $100,000 worth, right? And so you need something when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And that intermittency isn't well understood. And you have even policymakers, including here in the UK, stating that actually the world could be 100% renewables, and it's just a matter of political will and getting rid of obstacles, and that renewables is the cheapest form of energy. Of course, when you look at the generation cost, but you ignore availability, it's like saying, I've got the cheapest electricity, but it only runs on Mondays. You can't ignore the cost of what you need to back it up on Tuesday and until the rest of the week. So I think that misconception is there. And the other big one, of course, is that somehow renewables and electrification means we won't need oil and gas anymore. If we look at total global energy, electricity is about 18-19%, and that is becoming more renewables. There are limits to how far it'll go because of grid stability and the intermittency.
Yeah.
But the other 80+% is fuels. So we still don't have an electric solution for trucking, for air travel and freight, for shipping, plus making things. I mean, people don't appreciate. You wake up in the morning, you use toothpaste, you have a shower. Guess what? You put oil in your mouth with the toothpaste. You put it on your hair with the shampoo, on your body with the shower gel. I mean, it's just around us. And actually the fastest growing use for oil is making things, including the electric cars and the roads that they drive on and the solar panels and the wind turbines. I mean, everything that the transition is relying upon still requires oil. And none of that is appreciated. And it's kind of obvious to people in the industry, but I think we don't do a good enough job of explaining it. And so some false narratives are allowed to take hold, which are actually dangerous. They're not just dangerous for energy, the cost of energy and the cost of living and energy access, but they're dangerous for the climate. Because the underinvestment that we see, particularly in natural gas, I think oil is being more and more handled by national oil companies. But on the natural gas side, we estimate that total worldwide investment is about $250 billion a year, and it needs to be double that to meet the demand growth. And so you have more burning of coal in Asia and Africa. You've got 200 coal plants currently under construction in China. You've got India publicly declaring it will double its mining and consumption of coal by the end of the decade. And you can't blame them. These are the countries that are they're the engines of global growth. Yeah. And they have rising populations and industrial demand. And yet their consumption per capita is still a fraction of the OECD, of the global north, the Western world. And there's this historical issue as well. And I'm not one to rail against the West at all. I've studied here and lived here. But from the point of view of the global South, Africa, Asia, Latin America, all of these countries were colonized by, the countries of the global north today, who use those resources to fuel their own industrial development. And they want and expect the same standard of living for their people that these countries enjoy, the richer Western world enjoys. Nobody in Europe is offering to give up stable energy. Yeah. And yet the lecturing to the Western world or to the global South is, you should make do with a solar panel and a battery while we, enjoy this standard of living. It's not going to work. It's immoral and it's impractical. Yeah. Because ultimately they want and expect the same. And we have 800 million people without access to any electricity, and that number has unfortunately grown since COVID. We've got nearly 3 billion people without access to clean cooking So they still burn wood and dung, and the World Health Organization estimates 4 to 5 million die every year because of that. And they have a right to expect that. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, climate action is one of the 17. But energy access is also one, health is also one, education is also one, clean water is also one. All of these require energy.
Yeah.
So energy poverty is poverty.
Yeah.
And it's a fundamental moral imperative, I think, facing the world.
Yeah. You talk about investment there, and as you mentioned, as population grows, we need more energy, not less. What would be your message to the investors that are leaving the space? Where do you think investors can invest to have the biggest impact? And how can we engage with those investors to talk to them about projects and the impact that their investment has?
So natural gas in particular, I mean, we as Crescent Petroleum, headquartered in the UAE and active in the Middle East for over 50 years now. And our own transition has been, we did more oil in the UAE, and now we're 85% gas in places like Iraq and through our affiliate in Egypt. And the role of natural gas in the transition has been formally recognized by the UAE declaration last year, COP28, and by the EU. Mm-hmm. And yet, we haven't seen that reflected in the capital markets, and we've seen banks and capital markets sort of moving away from oil and gas, leading to this underinvestment and leading to more burning of coal. And of course, compounded by the Ukraine-Russian war, and the fact that Europe isn't buying Russian gas means that Europe has been seeking gas from the developing world, buying US LNG, but also looking to Africa. So those resources that could have benefited locally in places like Africa are now only being financed by Western institutions, providing the LNG goes to Spain and Italy and Germany. And yet those countries in the developing world can't benefit from their own resources. And so you've seen recently Africa creating an African energy bank explicitly to finance fossil fuel projects.
Yeah.
So I fear an undermining of the legitimacy of Western institutions and investors if they ignore this need. And the basic message is, if you really want to tackle climate change, by failing to invest in natural gas, you're actually making things worse, because despite the trillions of subsidies for renewables, emissions have been rising, mainly because of coal burning in Asia. Asia today, and it'll be Africa tomorrow.
Yeah. If you, so much of this misconception and perhaps decisions to leave the space from investors, etc., I think come from an alarmism within media that is really rife, and that leads to people, kind of the general public, not understanding kind of the energy systems and where they come from and how they fit into how they live every day. If you were speaking to someone who knew nothing about the oil and gas industry, how would you describe what needs to be achieved with regards this energy transition?
So first of all, we need to look back and recognize that the modern energy system, which certainly people who are well-off in well-off countries can take for granted, until there was a bit of a threat to that even in Europe 2 winters ago, and we saw the reaction. Yeah. European governments doing exactly what they'd been telling the global south not to do. Burning coal again, subsidizing energy. And energy subsidies are bad, the World Bank says. And yet here in the UK, half our bills were covered by the government, but it was energy support, not subsidy. Yeah. But it's a subsidy. Yeah. It's a blatant subsidy. So that's what happens, when there's a threat to energy access. And yet there's so many people who don't even have that energy access to begin with. And energy is, after all, the lifeblood of the economy. And the modern energy system has enabled, over the last century plus, phenomenal improvement in human prosperity. Yeah. Everything from the food system to medicines to life expectancies. There's no way this planet could sustain comfortably 8 billion people without the heating and the air conditioning and the food and the medications that have been enabled by that. Now, there are some, activists or groups who come from a worldview that human impact is just fundamentally wrong and bad, and that the world would be this perfect, Garden of Eden that we've somehow polluted with our existence. Some of them went so far as to celebrate during COVID that this was nature's way of reducing the human population. I reject that worldview and call on everyone to reject that worldview. Our approach to energy and climate must be human-centric. I mean, you always hear, save the planet, save the planet. The planet's been around for 5 billion years. We've only been around for tens of thousands of years. I have no doubt the planet will be here when we're all gone and some other species probably dominates. And the planet has been through much hotter and much colder and much higher CO2 levels than we have today. What matters is human prosperity. That's my world view. And we have an issue with emissions. We need to find a way to decarbonize the modern energy system while investing in the new energy system, but in a way that sustains energy supplies and increases them as needed for the developing world without harming human prosperity and development.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I agree. Talking of emissions and talking of the alarmist nature of the media as well, there was an article in the FT recently that had a pretty alarmist headline around oil and gas companies disguising their carbon emissions. What are your thoughts on this, and how can we guard against that kind of rhetoric that I think gives people misinformation and a lack of understanding?
Yeah, with all respect to the FT, they're a bit schizophrenic in some of their reporting. I understand they have a climate team who writes one thing and an energy team who writes something else, and of course, that doesn't make sense to me. As I've said, it's part of a whole nexus and needs to be addressed that way. So I think, first of all, recognizing how oil and gas is used is changing and will change, but it's still going to be needed throughout the energy transition. We'll fail with the energy transition without it. But then secondly, how we as operators, in the industry need to improve what we do and how we do things. So turning to Crescent Petroleum as an example, the gas that we produce in the Middle East avoids more than 5 million tons a year of CO2, which is more than all the Teslas. So that, critical role gas has to play. It replaced coal here in the UK, enabled the last coal plant to be turned off, Radcliffe, in just September this year. Enabled the US to come down to 1965 per capita levels of emissions. In the Middle East, we don't burn coal, but there was a lot of burning of liquid fuels, so gas replacing liquid fuels. But then how we produce. So we, for many years, been focused on measuring emissions, reducing emissions, leakages down to 0.12% of production, near zero, keep pushing it down, and then offsetting the remainder with UN-certified carbon credits that support wind power in places like Mongolia and China to achieve net zero carbon neutrality across our operations from 2021. We thought we'll do it first instead of just making a target decades from now, and we've maintained that. And so our carbon intensity now is below 5 kilos of CO2 per barrel of oil equivalent, which is well below a third of the industry average.
Yeah.
So we've certainly got to focus on that side about how we do things, and we welcome the zero methanes initiative and the OGDC and all these very good industry initiatives. But we also need to do a better job of explaining, because that's our process. But it's not our process alone that is being maligned. It is the product itself and its use. So the explanation of that and how that's critical, I think is important to get out. I mean, if we look at, one of our gas projects in Iraq, we got support from the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, $250 million for one of our expansion projects. And the reason was that we could demonstrate very clearly how the project was aligned with Paris goals, because the natural gas is replacing diesel for power generation, as well as providing huge socio-economic benefits for the local population.
I think, one of Pragma's kind of key goals is to bring more of a positivity, more positivity to industry and positive case studies that showcase the improvements that we are making in industry. And using Crescent, I think, is a great example. My understanding is you guys achieved net zero back in 2022 with the operations. We'd love to be able to keep showcasing these positive examples. What would your advice be to other operators looking to match this achievement? I love what you said about putting these goals in for 2030. It's just like a random date that's been picked out that sounds good, whereas you've looked at it and gone, this is actually what we can do, and let's do it rather than talk about it. So what can other operators learn from that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is measure. Like anything, you can't improve unless you measure. And the technologies for enhancing measurement now with the drones and other technologies is really making that easier and more effective. And then most of the actions we took were actually accretive value-wise because we sell natural gas. So preventing losses is actually enhancing revenues. There are, of course, some operators in isolated places, whether in Central Asia or even in the United States, where gas isn't the primary product, and there are issues over flaring. So there needs to be a way to capture and provide value. But natural gas isn't only an important transition fuel today, it is actually the window to future technologies such as carbon capture, hydrogen, and so on.
Yeah. Well, listen, I've got one last question that's a bit self-serving, but we were really excited as Pragma to have you on the board and to be able to represent, a region that is so important in the oil and gas sector. But why were you interested to join us and join the Pragma board?
So thank you. No, it's an honor, and I think the unique outlook and vision that you guys have, your experience in the sector, but also your youth and your enthusiasm for this sector, I think is refreshing. It's special. It's unique. Very much agree with your outlook and what the strategy is and what you're trying to achieve, and the great colleagues that you brought together on the board. My area of the Middle East still holds half the world's oil and gas reserves, proven oil and gas reserves. In fact, it could be even higher than that. And the lowest cost and the lowest carbon, but also very high potential in other areas. So the cheapest solar power in the world is being generated in the UAE. You also have significant investments in new technologies. I mean, at scale, whether it's hydrogen, carbon capture, and the strategic geographic location. So I think the Middle East will continue to be the energy hub and powerhouse for the global economy, not at the expense of others, of course. I mean, it's very exciting what's happened in the US. The US is another successful model of all of the above. You've got record high investments and production in oil, gas, renewables, and now technologies. Of course, the Inflation Reduction Act really moving the needle there. So I think it is an exciting time for energy. I think we're seeing some swinging back of the pendulum to a recognition that sustainability can't be achieved and sustained without energy access and affordability. So I'm hopeful, but it takes a lot of work. It takes good communication, good engagement, and that's something I'm sure Pragma will play a key role in going forward.
Thank you. No pressure then for us. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time and look forward to doing this again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.